under your butt.
Da-da-da. Okay, welcome to episode 138 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As usual, I'm Darren, joined by Mary, and today is a special day as we are here at the Lutheran Seminary for the 24 hours on the seminary, joined by the great Codie Eash, the Director of Education and Interpretation. And we are in front of a live audience. There's probably 800 people here, I would say. And so it's a full crowd. So it's an honor to be here. So thanks for having us, Codie.
Thanks for being here.
Wow, you just inflated your numbers like McClellan.
I mean, pick up an F-150 later. You know? But in any case, for the most part, it's a great opportunity to be here. And here in Gettysburg, there's a lot of cool things happening. And before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of why we're here, I guess let's talk, Codie, specifically about this awesome event we have going on here today. And looking at the crowd, there's some people who've been here for the entire time. Some may need a shower and a nap, but they're all here. So I guess we can go into what's going on here at the seminary.
Yeah, I'm in the shower and nap crowd myself. So we are in the middle of 24 Hours on the Ridge. For listeners' context, we've been doing this since 5 p.m. last evening, November 1st, and it's now just after 10 o'clock in the morning on November 2nd. So we're down to our last 7 hours here of 24 Hours on the Ridge. But this is our fourth annual event like this. It was the brainchild of Rob Williams, our Director of Outreach, who, a hand for Rob, yes. Who, as a few of you who were here last night heard me tell this story, that Rob was inspired in 2021 to have an event like this because of an episode of Parks and Recreation where they have a 24-hour, giving spree-esque event happening. And there's something happening on the hour every hour is essentially the theme. So this is the fourth year that we've done this, and it is in support of the Adams County Community Foundation Giving Spree, which takes place every November and is meant to encourage giving toward nonprofits in the Gettysburg community and throughout Adams County. And it is one of the largest giving sprees in the entire country, one of the largest days of giving. And per capita, it's actually the most successful, the largest in the entire United States, according to the Community Foundation. And so we do 24 Hours on the Ridge in the lead up to it. So the giving spree itself is next Thursday, November 7th. And we do 24 Hours on the Ridge with a series of podcast recordings like this, special tours throughout the entire 24 hours, speakers, walking tours, screening of the movie Gettysburg. The Mike Lentz stayed for all 4.5 hours at midnight to 4:30 in the morning. And
director's cut, too.
Director's cut, yes.
So he gets the extra bonus.
He did, got the extra 17
There'll be a
minutes.
disturbance in our town.
Filmed right here on the seminary campus. That scene was, yeah. So, it's a fun event. It's a tiring event. It takes a lot of prep work, but that's made all the better by the supporters like you all in the audience and by wonderful guests like you.
Appreciate the kind words, and the work that the seminary does is not just this. There's a lot of great things they do all year round. The consortium, all the speakers they have, and it's great to be here because it's really I don't want to say an underappreciated jewel, but it kind of is because there's a lot of cool stuff in this town. But here at the seminary, I think some of the best presentations I've ever seen in Gettysburg have been here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, and it's the thing that we keep a whole lot of pride in. Our museum's been open since 2013. And really up until that time, this landscape on Seminary Ridge and the campus of what is now United Lutheran Seminary was sort of an untapped resource. It was a piece sort of outside of town where the auto tour route comes past historic Schmucker Hall and the seminary buildings. But for a long time, the seminary, and maybe we'll get into this story, it sort of sees itself as separate from incorporating the story of this bloody event of this battle because it is a place of peace where ministers study. And really up until 2013 when our museum opened, that was not a well-demarcated piece of the story, but since that time, through programs like this, through educational programming, through the museum itself, we've been able to bring those stories to life.
And the focus of the museum is the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is what we're going to talk about today on this special episode we're doing. But it's not just the soldiers and the fighting, it's the townspeople, it's what they're going through, which is that very human side of the story that sometimes it gets left behind when we're discussing the Civil War.
Yeah.
And we just focus on the fighting where it's, the one thing that, like I've always said is that, the army packs up and leaves, but it leaves a mark. And that mark is felt for years, sometimes generations to come. Like when you think of the story of Elizabeth Thorne and how she is burying those soldiers after the battle, and that she said that her daughter that was born 3 months after the battle passed away when she was young, and she believed it was because of the trauma that she went through. So there's that impact that is felt, and the seminary does a great job of telling that side of the story too.
Yeah, we appreciate that, and you know, it's the constant reminder as you go through the museum that, you know, you start with the first day of the battle, its impact on the people and the landscape around the seminary, and then you go to the story of the seminary hospital and Civil War medicine, and you take a look at the fact that what you just learned about on the fourth floor, this is what it does to the human body. These are the hundreds of patients who are treated in and around this building. And then you go to the second floor and you broaden that view out, and you realize that though the shooting battle just erupted in July 1863 on this landscape, there was a decades-long battle over theology, over slavery, over emancipation, over sectionalism. We're just 8 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. Students are coming from both northern and southern markets to study here. Gettysburg was chosen strategically for that reason in 1826 as a place for a Lutheran seminary that would be appealing. And now all of a sudden it finds itself at the crossroads of the debates over the Civil War and the battle itself, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you kind of hinted on it before, is this is the bloodiest 6,000 acres in the United States by far. And anybody who's walked this grounds, you can it's sort of somehow became like the most peaceful place you can possibly be. You sit there on a little round top, or you sit here on the cupola and look out, and it's hard to imagine. It's like the land gave up every absolute ounce of evil it ever had at one time. And it's created almost this paradise of just peace, and it's hallowed ground still, obviously, but it's just that it's a fabulous type of contrast. And here, you guys do a great job of that as well, telling the story and just going through the history of Schmucker and about the whole situation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we appreciate that.
So, well, I was gonna say we'll talk about the first day and how they ended up getting here. And right off the bat, we're in a seminary here, and no one's been hit by lightning, so anything beyond this point's gravy. So we're happy with that. You know, the Battle of Gettysburg, it's one of those things where you study it, and people tend to look at June 3rd all the way till July 4th is the Gettysburg campaign. But like anything else, Gettysburg is the volcanic eruption versus all the tremors that took place leading up to it. You can follow it back a second Winchester. You can follow it back to a whole bunch of different things. But how the armies ended up here, it's fascinating when you look at the absolute story. It's a battle that the armies literally met on the march, and it was a situation where it was the first time really the first time when this big battle that both commanders obviously weren't here, and all the changes that took place. 7 Army Corps here at Gettysburg, not one had that job a year before at Antietam. So you look at the change. Meade taking over on the 28th, making captains into generals on the cavalry side. It's actually fascinating. And we've had 160 plus years to study and research this, but when you look at this in real time, it's really fascinating. I find the best firsthand account of any soldier diary, if anybody's read Abner Small's diary from the 16th Maine. Apologies to my 20th Maine friend here with this hat on. But he talks about the fact, because you read guys like Charles Wainwright or Chamberlain, speaking of him, they talk about the war or a battle like they're looking at a panoramic picture, right? And he talks about the fact that the Civil War was 50 feet in front of you, 50 feet to the left, and 50 feet to the right. That's all you knew. And the example I use is if you're an offensive guard in a football team, you don't know what the wide receiver on the flank is doing. You know what you're doing. And so you can get this firsthand account. And when you talk about the pure confusion that took place here on the first day, just imagine, you're Robert E. Lee. You have your army spread over a 55-mile radius, west, north, and east of town. You think that the Union Army is still across the Potomac. They were moving about 6 miles a day at that point. Now they're moving 20 miles a day, and you find out that how close they are. Now you got 3 corps. You got 2 inexperienced corps commanders when Stonewall went down. And all of a sudden, you're looking at a potential disaster and how the whole thing went. And then you can see how his game plan changed from fighting that defensive battle to fighting an offensive battle. So when you really look at the actual Battle of Gettysburg, it's just a fascinating study because there are so many aspects to it that take place.
Oh, there really are. And Small is one of my favorite figures as well. Both his work as a regimental historian and his diary. And when we talk about the fighting here on Seminary Ridge, he plays a key role in sort of the lead up to that. I think it's also small in that same entry where he talks about how minute your view of battle is. It's either him or another account like it where they say there are essentially 160,000 individual battles of Gettysburg happening at the same time. That anyone who attempts to understand a battlefield as a whole, who is a participant, it's virtually impossible to do.
That's small. And I was basically paraphrasing his quote, but your paraphrase is a little closer than mine. But that's basically how it was. But it's important to study, though, because I think when we tend to look at this, we tend to look at it from the big picture, not the lower picture, right? We say all the time that corps are made of divisions of brigades, brigades of regiments, regiments of companies, but companies are made of husbands and sons and brothers, right? And it's important to when you study at that angle, that grassroots level, first of all, it becomes more personal because everyone, for the most part, has a relative, a friend of a relative who fought here. And the other thing that's important to know, too, is it wasn't that long ago. Mm-hmm. The Civil War was not that long ago, and we still are dealing with the ramifications of it today. Think if you have a real bad broken bone, it doesn't heal correctly. It's going to carry you. You're going to deal with it for the rest of your life, and that's what our country is today in a lot of different ways.
Well, how close is it when you look at Richard Nixon's grandfather is killed, or great-grandfather is killed at this battle? That's not that far removed from us. And you have that story when you were at the beer garden, shockingly, and you shook the hand of that older gentleman, and he said you just shook the hand of a man who shook the hand of a Confederate veteran who fought here.
Yeah, he was a child in 1938 at the 75th reunion. And he was an older man. He's probably got to be gone by now, but he was telling me the story how he met Confederate soldiers who fought here when he was a child at Gettysburg. And I was like, wow, okay. It just kind of brings it all home. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about how they got here. And I think it's fascinating because, Lee's army spread out. The Union army's coming from the south, and so there's always that thing where the Union came from the south and the Confederates came from the north. It's not 100% true, but it's I guess sort of theoretically. But how they got here is fascinating because they talk about the 10 road networks that lead to Gettysburg. I mean, there's really 3. There's the 3 main pikes: Chambersburg, Baltimore, and York. But there's the rest of the roads are dirt roads that come in here. For every 30,000 men, or actually for every 10,000 men and their supplies, you need 30 miles of road in the Civil War. There's no I-83 anymore back then. There'd be trucks on it if there were. I'm sure there would be. That's another story. But, so you have to find a way to bring the army together. And, of course, they find the point of Gettysburg. And Gettysburg with no strategic value whatsoever. And we can talk about Buford and the rest of it.
You mean there weren't shoes?
They were going for the outlet. That's what they were going for. So I'll say it again. But yeah, so we can talk about how they ended up getting here and the importance of, say, John Buford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Want me to take that?
Sure.
Yeah. When we look at John Buford, of course, a celebrated cavalry division commander who is going to be sort of the cavalry reconnaissance mission on the left wing of the Union Army. Sorry if I stumble over my words. I'm working off 2 hours of sleep here overnight. But Buford, in the left wing of the Army of the Potomac, has 3 corps of infantry behind him. It's concentrated mostly around Emmitsburg, Maryland, just across the Mason-Dixon line, 12 miles or so from Gettysburg. The 1st Corps of John Reynolds, who is temporarily the left-wing commander, the 3rd Corps of Dan Sickles, and the 11th Corps of Oliver Otis Howard. And
so it begins.
The first mention of Howard, yeah.
I don't have anything to drink this time either.
So when Buford is making his way toward Gettysburg, I think one thing that often gets lost in the shuffle of when we think about his arrival is, we consider he comes up the Emmitsburg Road. This is sort of the first place that he was meant to go. But in reality, he goes where first? Fairfield, 8 miles southwest of Gettysburg. And it's there on the morning of June 30th that he encounters a few regiments of Confederate infantry. A skirmish breaks out. Buford realizes, all right, now one of those 8 roads that goes to Gettysburg, where I'm supposed to go to sort of screen the movements, get a sense of where the Confederate Army might be concentrating, get a sense of whether some of these civilian reconnaissance accounts coming in are accurate. Now he realizes, I can't go directly to Gettysburg from Fairfield. That's occupied. Rebel forces are there. So he goes back into Maryland, crosses back over the Mason-Dixon line, gets to Emmitsburg, makes his way north along Emmitsburg Road, and arrives here at about 11 a.m. on June 30th. And when he gets to Gettysburg, He becomes immediately frustrated by the people of the town. He's not complimentary of
Cannot imagine that.
and that becomes a common trend that we see among military officers and then eventually the medical staff in the aftermath of the battle. And then you start to see the current goes the other way. By the fall of 1863, we start to see a lot of these folks who were here for a longer time are starting to defend the people of Gettysburg. But Buford feels they get off on the wrong foot. Famously issues this orders the I think it's the Star and Banner to print this poster to not give any of his men alcoholic imbibements while they're in Gettysburg. But then the remarkable thing about Buford, among a series of remarkable things about Buford at Gettysburg, to me is that evening of June 30th. And on our midnight cupola tour last night, we were talking a bit about this. Is when he starts to write about what he understands the situation to be. And he sends this note to John Reynolds that evening of June 30th. And he says, it looks like I have 2 Confederate corps to the west of me, massed around Cashtown and Chambersburg, of James Longstreet and A.P. Hill. And I have about a third of the Confederate Army north of me, Ewell's corps, starting to mass on the backside of Carlisle. And there's a report from Confederate division under Jubal Early that's supposedly marching through the town of Berlin, a reference to East Berlin, about 15 miles northeast of Gettysburg. And as I like to often say, it's almost as if Buford has just read a book about the Battle of Gettysburg and is reporting that to John Reynolds, when in fact he is just laying out as best he understands the situation incredibly accurately, as we now know. Mm-hmm. There's one interesting facet of that, though, that I think often gets overlooked and is probably partly colored by the fact that John Reynolds, a key player in the story, dies on July 1st. Spoiler alert. And John Buford dies 5.5 months later of typhoid fever. Neither survives the year. And so both of their statuses are, as we do with historical figures, elevated. And we have depictions like the movie Gettysburg, like the novel The Killer Angels. And what we see oftentimes depicted is that there's this wonderful working relationship between these two men, which from a leadership perspective is certainly in part the case. They both do their jobs incredibly well. But there's a big caveat to that story. There's an asterisk. And it's when Buford sends the note to John Reynolds that evening. He mentions in the official reports, the dispatch that's sent, there's a note that says that what Buford is referencing is not included. It's never found. But he makes reference to a note that was picked up from a dropped Confederate, that a Confederate dropped, of that report of Confederates in East Berlin. And Reynolds goes sort of behind Buford's back, doesn't reply directly to Buford, but passes a message along. I forget if it's to Howard or to Alfred Pleasanton. Mm-hmm. And he says, I do not believe Buford's report of Confederates at Berlin. And so we can see there that Reynolds is almost entirely convinced that the entire Confederate Army is going to be making its advance from the west. But as we know, ultimately, in the end, Buford is accurate, and Reynolds, of course, will heed that warning and makes his way to Gettysburg by the following morning. But, really remarkable when we just consider the information gathering apparatus of both civilian networks as well as Buford's role as a cavalry officer, how accurate it is.
And I think the civilian network we got to talk about is the very underappreciated BMI, mm-hmm. the Bureau of Military Information, and guys like David McConaughey, mm-hmm. who a lot of people don't study here in Gettysburg, was part of that civilian network. Because this town was living on, the boy who cried wolf for a while. Because the Confederates were supposed to be coming in here, all the time. And you had Jubal Early roll through here at the end of June. But then he goes towards York, and okay, maybe this thing's over. Maybe we survive this. But then all the campfires start showing up on the mountain. Mm-hmm. And they realize that they're actually coming. But I think to your point about the citizens, I think they obviously, I'm sure they were very happy to see Buford, who was here. Mm-hmm. And it's always a question of why he was here anyway. Mm-hmm. Because it's just, if you read, say, Kent Masterson Brown's book on Meade, and he talks about the reconnaissance and force. Buford's going to come out here, fall back to the 1st, fall back to the 3rd, fall back to the 11th. And there's that whole thing with the Pipe Creek plan that's always going to be debated. But I think it's interesting you mentioned the town and how they specifically were as they started to deal with this. Mm-hmm. Because you've been hearing about the Confederates for a long time. Now they're coming. Now they're gone. Now they're coming again. And the animosity they had towards Buford. And I think a lot of it, you joke about it, a lot of it was that alcohol order. I think it was. Because they people here don't like being told what to do. They don't. And,
no one does.
No, of course not. but they're coming, and I think obviously the famous story is obviously with Henry Harrison and the spy reporting that they're coming up here, and you have to imagine Lee would have been somewhat incredulous about that report too, because you have two armies, gigantic armies, bumbling in the dark in places they don't really know where they are. You're getting reports from Governor Curtin, from Darius Couch, all these people in Pennsylvania who are hearing about these overinflated numbers. Couch was the one who was giving McClellan all the big numbers in Maryland. So you have to wonder how you got to take this whole thing with a grain of salt specifically, but it just goes to show the mayhem that this whole thing was when it started to get underway, even heading into 7:20 in the morning on July 1st.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the cry wolf situation. This is an important thing to consider, is that for people in all of these south central Pennsylvania counties whose southern borders are Maryland, the Civil War is not just this abstract thing as it is to many Northerners, where there's never really any genuine threat of Confederate incursion. But here in south central Pennsylvania, you have 3 consecutive years where you see sizable numbers of rebel forces moving across the Mason-Dixon line. In 1862, we see cavalry getting right to the outskirts of Cashtown, and the people of these south central Pennsylvania counties undoubtedly could have heard the distant guns at the battles of South Mountain and Antietam. And then you have, in 1863, of course, what we know happens July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. But on June 26th, when Jubal Early first passes through with Confederate infantry and a contingent of Elijah White's cavalry, there's sort of this breathing of a sigh of relief we see in some diaries, that the people of Gettysburg think, okay, now we've seen the war, what we feared has passed. Union cavalry passes through June 28th under Joseph Copeland on their way east toward Hanover. And then Buford's cavalry arrives on June 30th. And there is this sort of parade-like atmosphere that does play out. And so Buford has his sort of gripes with the how he's dealing personally with the people of Gettysburg. But for the soldiers, we do see that there are these stories of women singing, of people waving flags, of handing out flowers and baked goods and all of these sorts of things. So it is this celebratory sort of moment as well.
My thing leading into the battle that I've always wanted to know, and that I would love to be a fly on the wall for, is that meeting on June 30th between Reynolds and Howard. Mm-hmm. Because there was, I think, things said there that we don't know. Yeah. And Reynolds is gone within, less than 12 hours of that meeting. Mm-hmm. Howard, in his memoirs, he does what I like to call vague booking. He's very vague about what was discussed at that meeting. It was basically, we met for dinner. Reynolds seemed depressed, almost as if he had a premonition of his death. And we went over what he had received. And then Howard goes back to Emmitsburg, and within a few hours of getting back there, he's been called up to go to Gettysburg. But that is like one meeting in the Civil War. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall, because I think there's kind of a little missing piece there of what is going to happen.
Well, there's the debate of whether or not Reynolds even heard of the Pipe Creek Plan. I mean, there's reports that Captain Dickinson was there and showed up, and so, but no one really knows, because if he might have got it stuck in his back pocket and never read it. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why you do history, because it's not science, it's not black and white. There's a gray area. It's interpretive. No one's always wrong, no one's always right. It's just how it's interpreted, and that's a big one though. And you could trace the Battle of Gettysburg back 400 million years ago if you really want to, because when the mountain was created, it created the ridges here. Yeah. If you really want to really go back, because it created Harris Ridge and all the Seminary Ridge, and that's when we get into the first how important those ridges were. So you can track it if you really want to get back in the Wayback Machine. You can go back to then. But we talk about how that first day and the reports of Union cavalry in town, and this is where the J. Johnson Pettigrew story comes in. And he's new to his brigade commands, and he's in Henry Heath's division. And the town, everyone knows the story. The town is defended by militia with shotguns, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes in, he sees what he thinks is Union cavalry, because this is the way they drill and how they conduct themselves. He goes back and tells his boss is Union cavalry here. Oh, you have no idea what you're talking about. They're just militia. You're new. Just leave me alone. But I always found fascinating was the next, he's like, well, can we go in tomorrow, and the famous go get those shoes story, right? Which can mean a lot of things. I mean, get those shoes was also an acronym for kick their butts. So good, let's get their shoes. And also for supplies. There is no shoe store in Gettysburg. But when you're leading into that, and this is a question I've always wondered, if Heath did not believe Pettigrew's account that there were Union cavalry in Gettysburg, why are you sending that many people, 22 cannon, 10,000 plus men into town on a full raid mission? So, and that's one of the mysteries about Gettysburg.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing too, that to Heath's credit, the shoes story mythology isn't something that just develops later. He mentions that in his report. And I think this is one thing that when we put ourselves in the moment, we know what we know now. In that moment, it's entirely plausible that either on one hand, he's utilizing this as an excuse, that he's keeping in his back pocket because of what ultimately escalates after. But it is also equally possible that he, in that moment, thinks that there might be shoes, thinks there might be supplies or horseshoes or whatever, he possibly meant by that. So we know that it's a myth today, but important reminder that in that moment there are these things that those folks know, or those folks don't know that we know after the fact, and I think that's an interesting case study of that one.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it's great because you look back the vernacular back in the day, and it's one of those fun stories to talk about. Of course, Heath will have to buy himself a new hat coming through Cash Down, and it's going to be too big, and he's going to stick a newspaper in there, and a bullet's going to ricochet off the side of his head and make him loopy, but he's going to be okay. But also, when you're looking at the Corps Command, A.P. Hill, if you're going to do the guide exam and you want to make some good points, have a long tour on what A.P. Hill did here at Gettysburg, because I guarantee you'll never find anything. But if you do, you'll be a hero forever, right? But this is what you have coming in. So now Heath is going to be coming in. They're going to be coming on the Chambersburg Road, and you're going to have the 8th Illinois from Chicago. And the famous story is Marcellus Jones is going to take Levi Schaefer's gun, his carbine. He's going to put it on the thing, and he's going to let me start the ball, is a quote he says. What's interesting, too, is until very recently, who was part of the 8th was Elon Farnsworth. Mm-hmm. He had just been one of the guys promoted right before that. So it's these people. And the story is he shot at an officer on a light gray horse. Some people think it's Burkett Fry from the 13th Alabama. No one knows, but these are the stories that come out afterwards. But one thing that is true is that single shot likely delayed the Confederates 2 full hours. And as we're looking for that echelon fallback attack from Buford, how important that shot ultimately was.
Mm-hmm. And right from the get-go, we have this fascinating role that Gettysburg plays in our popular imagination. Chris Gwynn, many of you are familiar with here at Gettysburg National Military Park, he says that Gettysburg becomes the ultimate battle of superlatives. We are concerned at Gettysburg, and the veterans were as well, more than anywhere else in certainly American military history and almost anywhere in world military history, of who fired the first shot, who held out longest, who advanced furthest. These sorts of questions that we don't consider in as much detail as we do here, and it starts right from the beginning. The contested, at least 3 possible first shots, and this is the one that ultimately gets the monument and gets the story with it, and is the first one that leads to any sustained fighting, and we see that happen pretty much right from the beginning. And I think the other thing too that I would mention is right here on the campus of the Lutheran Seminary, we have, leading up to this, classes had stopped sometime around June 26th, but there are still several students who are lingering around, as well as the caretakers, the Ziegler family. Mary and Emmanuel are the steward and matron. They have 5 children living in the seminary building. And Lydia Ziegler, 13 years old, will later write an account about going up into the cupola the night of June 30th. And she can see Buford's cavalry encamped below her. She can see the campfires of Confederates on the side of South Mountain near Cashtown. She can hear the Union soldiers singing and praying and writing letters home. She wonders how many of the Confederates are doing those exact same things. And then as the firing begins on the morning of July 1st, there's a group of at least half a dozen seminary students, eventually joined by a couple of college students from Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College. And when the first shots are being fired at Knoxland Ridge, some 2 miles away, and the fighting really breaks out at her ridge, one of these students, Martin Luther Kohler, says we could clearly see the first puffs of smoke from the mouths of booming cannon. And how we oftentimes relate this, is especially to student groups, is you put yourself in this extraordinarily dangerous situation, and you ask yourself, how could they do that? Why would they do that? But it's such an abstract thing. It's happening at a mile, 2 miles distant. You're not within rifle or artillery range yet. And it's similar to today when we hear sirens or see flashing lights, and you just want to go outside and see what's happening. That's what's happening for a lot of these students, a lot of these young people at the seminary. But as the fighting gets closer, of course, then we're going to see strictly those military officers like John Buford, like his signal officer, First Lieutenant Aaron Jerome, among a series of other military officers who had started using that cupola the night of June 30th, and they'll continue through to about noon on July 1st.
And that's where you have the famous meeting, Reynolds coming down.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, but leading into that, though, Buford, he does a good job. I mean, he's got about 2,800 men. Don't forget, for every 4 guys, one's got to stay back and hold the horses. So you don't have a full amount of people. So you got to keep that in mind. Going up between 8,000 and 10,000 Rebs coming. And so you've got Archer's brigade, and you've got Davis's brigade, who's one of the single more incompetent Confederate generals I've ever. Nepotism rules in that situation. We talked the whole day on that one. But you're starting to push them back as this first wave is coming. And then he's looking out the cupola, and just like in the movie, he's looking for Reynolds, and he finally obviously does arrive. Remnants of that first corps start to arrive, and it's interesting because at this point, this is going to begin a change of the Union's going to have 6 commanders on the first day alone at the Battle of Gettysburg. When you look at Buford all the way until Meade, so it kind of shows that confusion that's going to kind of take over for the entire day.
Yeah, and you have Reynolds coming down at this point, meeting Buford. They have the "What goes, John?"
There's the devil to pay.
Yep.
Great quote,
I love that. There's
Anybody in
the
their work life who hasn't used that in real life is missing the boat, by the way.
Yep.
It's a great opportunity.
Yep. But you have that happening, and then Reynolds starts to make his way towards the fight. And it's around, like 10:30 in the morning. Yep. We're going to lose John Reynolds.
Yeah, he's going to be going with the 2nd Wisconsin. The Iron Brigades is those damn black hats have made the field, and the Confederates are realizing who they are. That they're realizing at this point, you know what, Pettigrew might have been right. And so it turns into a big deal. That first wave of that first day. And and again, to Codie's point, no one knows who shoots Reynolds. The bigger fish you are, it's got to be an elite sharpshooter. Some people think it's just a guy from the 7th Tennessee. No one knows, right? But again, it's going to begin an existential issue right off the bat, and he's going to go down. But this is what's going to begin a very underrated command by Abner Doubleday at this point that people don't tend to appreciate. The inventor of baseball, right? By the way, we all happy the Yankees lost? Right? Good. All right, just making sure we're on the same page. But the inventor of baseball, he's going to have a really, really good day here.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, and it's I think oftentimes in the grand scheme of things gets overlooked. This is his effective last day of field command at this level, because we start to see the infighting of the Army of the Potomac will ultimately win the day, and will come at the cost of Doubleday's the rest of his Civil War career in terms of in the field. And when we think about Doubleday, there are, I think, 2 things he's probably most famous for. One is being credited as the inventor, really just the popularizer, if that's a word, of baseball. But also the man who fired the first shot in defense of Fort Sumter. That's really his national claim to fame, and plays into why he is sort of created as the face for America's national pastime. But yeah, he has this I think undervalued day in command. Really, in his shoes, if we were to put ourselves in his shoes, he's just continuing with what he believes to be Reynolds' plan of defending McPherson Ridge and keeping that reserve back here at Seminary Ridge, which starts as just one regiment, the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, famously commanded by Rufus Dawes before they go to the railroad cut. And now enter the story really around this time. This is your reminder, as we should in any Civil War battle, that it's really tough to figure out what exact time things are happening. But around the time Reynolds is killed at the seminary, you're going to start seeing this as now a reserve position, in addition to being that signal station and observation post. And you have Dr. George New, who is Surgeon-in-Chief of the 1st Division, 1st Corps. He's establishing the first military hospital on the entire battlefield. And you're starting to see the arrival shortly thereafter of Gabriel Paul's brigade, who will start building a barricade that Doubleday orders to be constructed, and enter the story of the 16th Maine and Abner Small. Mm-hmm. And Small is one of many folks who talk about how Doubleday wants this barricade to be constructed using fence rails, using felled trees, digging up stumps, digging into the earth. Really, Doubleday, as he says in his report and as he testifies before Congress the following year, he says that I did this as a precautionary measure. And when I looked at this landscape, McPherson Ridge was the last place we could defend before we were forced to defend Seminary Ridge. And we were forced to defend Seminary Ridge to the last because there's nothing between it and the town of Gettysburg. And I think that's an important piece here, too, is that in hindsight, so often, and there are many ways you can interpret this, but I think the popular interpretation is the whole day, the whole ball game, is to defend the ridges west of Gettysburg to keep the ridges south of Gettysburg intact, to fall back there ultimately. But if we look up until about this time on July 1st, Buford's plan, Reynolds' plan, and by extent Doubleday's plan after Reynolds goes down, it seems to be to fight and win west of Gettysburg. None of them is really mentioning quite yet falling back south of town, really until Howard arrives shortly thereafter.
Yeah, but at this point, it's very much like the wheat field. I mean, who's in command on the Confederate side? Is Heath in command? Is Hill in command? Archer's been caught. He's famously caught and taken back to Doubleday, and they have their little exchange.
Yeah, doesn't he lose his mind on Doubleday or something?
He says, Doubleday, it's great to see you, General. He goes, not great to see you by a damned, or something like that. Great story. But again, you've got Davis's brigade is going to be north of Chambersburg, and you're going to have Archer's remains coming that way. And then you start to see you have Cutler across in the woods on the other side, and you've got Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade coming this way. And everything's kind of being pushed in, right? And then eventually, Doubleday, and you kind of made point of it, he was smart because he left that one regiment lying on their stomachs on the swale of McPherson Ridge, and that was the 6th Wisconsin. And he kept them in reserve. And he's going to look over to his right, and he's going to see Davis's guys pushing Cutler, the 147 New York, all that stuff, Miller's guys. Then they're going to start coming into what we know as the railroad cut. And Rufus Dawes, if you read his diary, he says it looks like the men were swallowed up because they were going into the railroad cut. The railroad had come to Gettysburg, but the tracks were not put in yet. It was just the cut. And he's going to ultimately turn and extend his way towards the railroad cut. And it's fascinating because just like Emmitsburg Road, you've got to jump the one fence, cross the road, jump the next fence. These Mennonite things, they don't come down easy. They're well built. Need more of those, right? And famously, he's going to have 175 casualties over 175 yards. The railroad cut, he's going to lose one man per yard. And he's ultimately going to, for the most part, push Davis's guys back up the railroad cut, heading back towards the Chambersburg area, and kind of, in essence, kind of slow down the Confederate roll, that first wave, right? And you've got Wainwright's his artillery, and at this point, you can just imagine Reynolds is down. Doubleday is doing his best to control the situation. You just found yourself in a fight that you did not expect. Meade was thinking they were going to, within 48 hours there'd be a battle, but not that very day. And now you're going to start to push the guns back to the seminary. But even that story is a good one, because if you read Wainwright's diary, he talks about a courier writing up to him saying, we're retreating back to the cemetery. But the person who gave him the orders had a German accent, and he didn't know if it was cemetery or seminary. He turns around, he sees Codie up there waving, seminary. So he says, well, it must be the seminary. So he's going to pull his guns back here, which is going to help set up that second wave that we'll talk about here in a few minutes.
And talk about relatables. It's confusing seminary and cemetery ridges is something that visitors definitely don't do to this day.
Yep. But, before we get to that part, while all this is going on, you have the 11th Corps starting to come down. And you have Oliver Otis Howard arriving. And he goes to East Cemetery Hill, and he says, well, this looks like good ground. And his staff member's like, it's the only ground. And then he goes to the Fahnestock House, and he climbs up there. And it's there where he gets a report that Reynolds has been wounded. And he's like, okay. And then he finds out a few minutes later that Reynolds is dead, and Howard is now in charge of the field. And you have more command changes that are having to happen in all the chaos of battle. So you have Carl Schurz being put in command of the 11th Corps temporarily. And that's one of the other kind of myths that you hear about Gettysburg is that, Howard does get blamed for a lot. But I think you have to take a step back and remember that, okay, it's Carl Schurz, and he's been thrown into this not expecting to have to command the 11th Corps. And Howard is trying to figure things out, and it's a lot going on.
Or the 11th Corps, too. I mean, it's the smallest corps here, by far, at the Army of the Potomac. Half of them are Germans. They don't like Howard. Howard doesn't like them. Howard is a stern Mainer, Bible guy. Germans like to drink a lot of beer. So it's not exactly a marriage made in heaven. And they were still upset that Franz Siegel was removed. So there's a lot of that behind-the-scene politics going on with this. But again, let you finish about Howard as he rides in like Fabio with his hair blowing in the wind, the light behind him. Like, you can actually imagine seeing it exactly,
But he's having to deal with all the chaos of battle and figure out where to put these men. And he sees East Cemetery Hill. And I think this is when we start to hear about East Cemetery Hill coming into the battle and it being the place where they're going to have to fall back on. And keep in mind, the other thing that Howard is carrying with him into this battle is what has happened to him and his corps at Chancellorsville. And he is probably afraid that this could happen again. And I'm sure all the corps commanders have that in their mind that, geez, like, this could be another routing for us. Like, what's going to happen?
Well, it's fascinating when you look at the first day because the Confederates do almost everything wrong. And they kind of end up winning the day. The Union does almost everything right, and it's like Charlie Brown in the football. You just can't get over it. But, on the north side, what Gettysburg College is now, the 11th Corps is starting to move across the field, which you kind of hinted at. And at this point, you're going to start to see the arrival of Robert Rhodes. And he's coming down and he finds himself, and this is, Robert Rhodes was one of the best Civil War commanders the Confederates had. He had a real bad day on July 1st. He'll end up dying at the September 19th of 64, 3rd Winchester. So he won't survive the war. But he was a good general for the most part. But he arrives on Oak Hill, and he's got Thomas Carter's battalion, those 22 guns. He has them all set up. And he finds himself on the flank. And Robert Rhodes had a really good history of being in the right place at the right time. And he finds himself there again. He has the largest division in that corps. But instead of attacking with his infantry immediately, he opens up on the guns. Everyone, look at me! Here we are. And it just changed everything. And now we introduce guys like Gabriel Paul and Henry Baxter into the equation. And so he ends up really, as the first phase is done, he's going to start this before the Perrin and the Scales one's going to come later on. But what it basically does is an opportunity was there. Just like Martin Sheen in the movie. There's an opportunity here, right? But unfortunately, he kind of jumped the gun with his artillery, and it led to really a very underrated aspect of the first day, which is the Battle of Oak Ridge.
And, to kind of put a couple pieces together here that, I'll keep coming back to the seminary. Not that I'm biased or anything, but these are sort of the last moments as Howard is arriving on the field and Rhodes is arriving, from their respective sides. These are the last moments that we know that the cupola is being used for observation. And this is one of those instances where so often when we try to corroborate primary sources, we find the disparities between them. Good example is the meeting between Buford and Reynolds. 7 eyewitnesses remember that meeting happening in at least 3 different locations from one another. They remembered entirely differently. In the case of Rhodes' arrival and Howard's arrival, we have 6 eyewitnesses, all centered around people who were here at the seminary, and they all remember different pieces, but of the exact same version of events. And what I mean by that is this is just a couple of their examples. Aaron Jerome, Buford's signal officer, he's still in the cupola. His main goal that morning had been watching the arrival of Confederate forces from the west, watching the arrival of Reynolds from the south. But after Reynolds arrives, after Reynolds is killed, after the fighting has now consumed McPherson Ridge, what's his next job? It's to keep an eye on what's happening to the north. And he sends a message to Howard. It's misdated in brackets in the official records as July 2nd, but surely based on the context, it's supposed to be July 1st. And Jerome says in that message, General Howard, over a mile-long division of rebels is arriving on our right. There is nothing but cavalry to oppose it. That would be Thomas Devon's brigade of Buford's cavalry before the 11th Corps arrives. This is Jerome telling Howard, you should move your men in that direction. Jerome writes 2 post-war accounts, 1865 and 1867, and he remembers this exact moment. And it seems as though that message that he delivered wasn't by signal flag, wasn't by courier. He claims that I physically climbed down from the cupola and rode over to Cemetery Hill. And in his memoirs, Howard mentions receiving this message, in aid of General Buford. And as that's happening, we can see Abner Small, another major figure of our story here, building the barricade on Seminary Ridge. And he writes, I remember looking up at the seminary cupola, and I noticed a group of officers, they're anxiously pointing to the north. He's seeing that interaction play out, and he sees those officers leave the cupola. The last person up there is sort of a footnote figure. His name is Joseph Orton Kirby. He was a telegraph operator. And he will arrive, I think he had either come up from Frederick or over from Hanover. I forget which. But the telegraph lines have been destroyed in the days preceding this. And he's asking Buford when he gets on the battlefield, should I establish a temporary telegraph line? And Buford says, yes, closer to town. And he climbs up in the cupola to plot where he's going to put his line. And when he gets up there, he sees that there's now this arrival of Confederate forces from the north. He looks around and realizes there are no other officers in the cupola remaining, and he quickly gets down. It's just one of those anecdotes where we can see multiple people telling different pieces of the story, and it's how we can get a sense of how these things are all happening at the same concurrent moment.
Yeah, so now you've got another issue coming from the north now. And so that story, small point, all the fingers pointing not west, but now pointing north to create a new threat coming from the north. And this is when you're going to have John Cleveland Robinson's 2nd Division of the 1st Corps send his troops, Paul and Baxter. And Small has a great quote about John Cleveland Robinson. He says, in a much bearded army, he's the hairiest man I ever saw. And if you Google his picture, you'll see, and even Henry Baxter, he was 42 years old at the Battle of Gettysburg. Pull up his picture and tell me he's 42 years old.
So much older.
I mean, he looks like he's like 72. I mean, that war, does things, obviously. But it's going to create that issue over the Mummersburg Road now, where they're going to have to build that defense. And like we were saying before, the opportunity for Rhodes to hit here was there, and the window was closing. He has George Doles set up where the McLean farm is, and just some skirmishes on Blocker's Knoll, which is why you had Barlow go out to that point, because he's going to take him off because he wants the artillery position. Whether he was rope-a-doping him or setting him up to move him out there, we'll never know. He doesn't know Jubal Early's coming. So he puts himself in that salient up there. But you're going to end up with a relatively small couple of regiments, a couple of brigades rather, having to hold on from Rhodes. And the way it's supposed to go is you're going to have Edward O'Neill, and then you're going to have Iverson and Junius Daniel all kind of surround and attack that point. And right off the bat, it all gets screwed up. And again, we say this all the time, communication, terrain, and weather. One of the three always gets you in these battles, always gets you, right? And this one's going to be communication. For whatever reason, he'll have the 3rd Alabama move. Colonel Battle will have no idea why he's being told to move, but he does. They're supposed to move all together at the same time. And O'Neill is going to send his men forward early, but O'Neill's not going to be with his men. He's going to go find Rhodes, and he's going to say, I can't move. I don't have a horse. He's like, well, what do you mean? Now, he was a colonel. And allegedly, Robert E. Lee had his papers to be made a general in his pocket during the battle, but he never signed them because this was not a good day for Ed O'Neill. And everyone knows the famous story with Iverson.
Drinking?
Well, Iverson's supposed to be attacking basically where the Forney farm was, and the story is he's behind the Forney farm, and he's whatever reason he can't make it. And you end up running into that gauntlet. Now, that road where the wall is now, that road that runs behind there, wasn't there at the time, obviously. It would have been much deeper. And so that wall would be much higher. And if you walk that ground, the ground undulates. It's just like pick a charge. You walk across that field, you can disappear. So they're going to walk across, and they're going to be hit hard by guys like 12th Massachusetts, for example, right? 11th PA. That'll be lined up on that wall that's going to rout them, which will be now known as Iverson Pits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the stories there that doesn't tie to the battle directly, but ties to a theme you mentioned earlier, is that notion of how peaceful the Gettysburg landscape is, and at the dedication of the 88th Pennsylvania Monument, 1889. I think it's part of Pennsylvania Day. That is the theme that the name of the veteran who delivers the speech is escaping me, but he delivers this speech on September 11th, 1889, and the theme of the speech becomes peace. And he says that like that's his takeaway from the Battle of Gettysburg is not remembering the battle and leaders and soldiers, and not even the causes and consequences of the war, but he says that what I want people to take away when they visit this battlefield is peace, blessed peace. And that's one of those places on the battlefield that when you stand, you can look around you and you see, other than traffic driving along Route 30 or along the Mummasburg Road, there's really nothing modern around you. It's really sort of one of those places on the battlefield when you step out to that like advanced position of the 88th Pennsylvania, you're sort of absorbed into the natural beauty and the peace of the landscape.
Yeah, and they obviously the spot of the Peace Memorial that's up there, which is built from Alabama limestone in Maine granite. So, unity, right? And so you're absolutely right, though. It's one of those places you can look out, and what's great about Gettysburg is the places you can go and the things you can see. It's not exactly the same. Oak Hill is much different than it is nowadays, but you can still see a lot of the same vista that a lot of these generals had made. And that's what's great about this place here.
Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about terrain you mentioned a moment ago is when we think about, and one of the reasons why, I mentioned that the cupola is not occupied anymore, but there's still 3 hours of fighting essentially, is A, you're sort of surrounded on both sides now, but B, the one place both then and now that you just cannot see any piece of the battlefield is ironically the tallest natural piece of the first day's battlefield. Oak Hill was not visible because of the foliage to observers then, and just like it's not now. And the reason we know it's not then is, one, because it's the only direction that any of the people who are up there, like Aaron Jerome, they don't talk about seeing it. And then the other thing is John Batchelder, first major historian of the battle, in 1873, for the 10th anniversary of the battle, he publishes Gettysburg's first guidebook, Gettysburg, What to See and How to See It. And he puts a little compass in there that you're supposed to take with you to the cupola. And it points in any direction, and it gives you the landmarks. And the northern pointing mark that he gives you it either says Oak Hill or Oak Ridge, and then in parentheses it says something like not visible due to trees. And so we can get a sense from that is one place that once the battle shifts to the north for that post-noon, early afternoon period, suddenly your tallest position that was so useful to these officers the evening before and throughout the first morning of the battle suddenly is relatively useless because you can't see that position and the rebels are just bearing in on both sides.
And then Jubal Early shows up.
Yep.
And that's the hard part is because you've got Barlow moved up, and here comes Lee's bad old man, right? Allegedly the only guy that Lee allows to swear around him. He swore more than you, and that's something, But I mean, so now you're being attacked. It's almost like a bigger version of the wheat field, if you know the wheat field. You're getting surrounded from all different angles, all at different points, except on a much bigger scale. And now here comes Early, which is going to really overturn the apple cart here. And you're going to start to see the retreat and the fallback. And Barlow's in a horrible position.
Yep.
He's got a salient built up. And so he's going to basically have to form a retreat. Now, again, your boy Howard, okay, got to mention him with this because he's helping setting up the defense on Cemetery Hill at this point. But the one thing, if you're going to pick on him for one thing, okay, I'm probably going to get yelled at for this, but I'm going to say it anyway, okay? If you want to pick on him, he did not set up his officers with a retreat plan through the town of Gettysburg. So when they were starting to work their way back to Cemetery Hill, they didn't know where they were going. It's tough enough driving around now in this town, but especially running back, being under fire and smoke being chased around. That's why you had a lot of guys like Schimmelfennig and a lot of troops hiding and getting caught. It was for that reason as they made their way back to Cemetery Hill.
Yeah.
And the one thing that the 11th Corps has a slight advantage over the 1st Corps when it eventually retreats through the town as well is most of the 1st Corps men had completely avoided the town when they came to Gettysburg. So for listeners in your mental map, Gettysburg is the top center of our map, and Emmetsburg Road is south of the town, and McPherson and Seminary Ridges are west of the town. They've cut across those fields. They haven't gone through the town. So the 11th Corps, despite the confusion, of course, of this matter, has at least some familiarity, perhaps with the size or the scope of the town of Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. The 1st Corps does not. And you also, coincidentally, you have on the right end of the of the 11th Corps, and now for 2 consecutive ridges that we'll talk about, McPherson and Seminary Ridge, the left flank of the 1st Corps, 2 9-month regiments, 2 temporary regiments that are pretty green to this whole Civil War thing. 151st Pennsylvania on the left flank and the 153rd Pennsylvania on the right flank. One of those strange sort of coincidences of the battle as well are these 9-month emergency troops raised in the summer of 1862, about to end their enlistments here in the summer of 63, and they're going to be placed in these sort of predicaments.
So you can imagine getting late in the afternoon on the 1st, things are falling apart for the Union. You've got Scales and Perrin, that second wave is attacking from the west. And now you have John Cleveland Robinson's division start to fall back as well. Gabriel Paul will be famously shot in the temple, go through his temple and actually come out the other side of his head. It does not kill him. He will actually live for 8,300 days exactly before he dies. And he'll spend most of his life with seizures, loss of sense of smell, loss of sense of taste. And he died years and years later, so you always got to wonder when you stop counting, right? The casualties. And he was one. So this is when they start to fall back, and they're going to need a regiment to sacrifice. And this is going to be the 16th Maine. And it's a fabulous story, and there's a good monument for it. You can see that the point's right over there down by where the 90th Pennsylvania Memorial is, right? That monument. Charles Tilden, he's a hard-fighting Mainer from Castine, Maine. If you know Maine, it's up by Maine Maritime Academy, way up there, just south of Santa's Workshop. That's how far north you're going, okay? So if you get up, so he is he's one of the guys, like a lot of Mainers, he was fighting to save the Union. Didn't care about slavery. A lot of Maine's economy was actually based on slavery because
lobster, right?
They would catch lobster and send that south the food for the slaves. Apparently, lobster wasn't a big thing back then. So when everything went down, it hurt them. That's why you see a lot of the copperheads in Maine, and specifically. But that's kind of where it all comes from. So he finds himself here, and he's commanding about 300 men right at the point. And Robinson's going to say, I need a regiment to sacrifice, because at this point, you have Dole's regiment, brigade rather. They're attacking. You've got the remnants of O'Neill's. You've got Daniel. Now you got Stephen Dodson. Rams are coming. So you're being pushed from 4 different angles. They need room to escape from the rest of his division, the rest of Paul's and the rest of Baxter's. He's chosen to sacrifice his regiment. And he famously turns to his men and says, well, boys, you know what that means. So they set up a small salient, and you can still see the salient point today, and they are going to hold off for about 15 minutes, just long enough for the rest of the division to get away. And the men are saying, Colonel, we cannot lose our colors. They're going to steal our flag. So he has all the men famously tear up the flags, stick them in their pockets, and you can still see them in some of the historical societies of Maine, remnants of the flags and the guidons, everything like that. He'll eventually be caught not far from where the Pizza Hut is, if you know the area. That's where he's going to be caught.
Pizza Huts always have either someone die or get caught.
Yeah. If there's a Pizza Hut on your battlefield, then you know something bad happened. But for the most part, what's going to happen is he's going to be caught, and he's going to famously be asked to turn in his sword. And he's going to whip it out like a true Mainer, slam it in the ground, and snap it in half and throw it at the feet of his captor. He'll personally be sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, where he'll promptly escape. He'll get back to his regiment. He'll be rewarded with a new horse. He's funny because he'll be caught later at Petersburg a second time, and he'll escape again. But a lot of his regiment, the 16th Maine, the survivors, only 30 made it back to Cemetery Hill. Most of them were captured. Some of those men would ultimately end up with Chamberlain the next day at Little Round Top to fulfill the 20th Maine. So that's why we always say that 16 is greater than 20 when you talk about Maine. And Gettysburg, not to disrespect Joshua Chamberlain, but again, he helped that division get back to Cemetery Hill, which is a very underrated story. And he's one of those guys, for whatever reason, Charles Tilden does not have a Medal of Honor, and he's like Robert Gould Shaw. He's one of the open omissions to that. But it's a great story when you study it, because really what he did is he saved most of those men to get back the best he could.
And he contributes something in the commemorative period, the monumentation period, that's valuable for us here, is that because the 16th Maine had been so instrumental in constructing the Seminary barricade, when Tilden draws this map that is in Maine at Gettysburg, 1891, I think it's published, after the dedication of the Maine monuments in 1889, which was, by the way, the occasion for Chamberlain's famous "In Great Deeds, Something Abides" speech. But nevertheless, Tilden draws this map of the whereabouts of the 16th Maine, and as part of that, he gives us really the best depiction by a veteran of physically the extent of the Seminary barricade. And it was sort of one of the big pieces when they were recreating a piece of that barricade for the museum project, 2012, 2013. It was in part based on Tilden's map that they were able to determine the left and the right ends of this almost 300-yard long barricade ultimately. A barricade that, as that action is happening on Oak Ridge, as we have the attacks further south of that here toward the seminary, that barricade built by the 16th Maine and the other men of Paul's brigade is used for nearly 2,500 federal troops of 3 brigades, the one right behind the barricade being Chapman Biddle's brigade, which had just been the last brigade to hold out at McPherson Ridge and now is the last brigade to hold out on Seminary Ridge. And this 2.5-foot tall barricade stalls the Confederate advance. The name of the game, of course, for much of July 1st is to stall but not stop, be the speed bump, not the stop sign for the Confederates. And this will be sort of that last vestige of that plan is this barricade built by the men of the 16th Maine, defended by the men of units like the 151st Pennsylvania, which is ultimately the last regiment to fall back here.
So you can just imagine the situation. You've got the Union troops running in full speed back to Cemetery Hill the best way they can. You've got Confederates coming from really all different directions, except from the south, really, which is ironic if you think about it. But now, what's the leadership situation going on at this point? What you're trying to rally around Cemetery Hill, which will be the focus of the battle on July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd. So how is that situation playing itself out in a leadership situation?
Well, this is where you have Howard is there on East Cemetery Hill, but then General Winfield Scott Hancock shows up, and he's been sent by Meade to, and you hear different reasons why. And Kent Masterson Brown says it was just because, Hancock's in the room at the time with Meade, and he just says, I need eyes on the battlefield. I need you because I have to stay here. Other people say it's because, Meade doesn't know Howard as well. He doesn't trust him, but he trusts Hancock. Whatever the reason, Hancock is going to come down to East Cemetery Hill, and he's got an order with him that says he is to take charge of the battlefield. And keep in mind, Hancock is, Howard is a higher ranking officer than Hancock. And Hancock says to Meade, well, this might be a problem. And Meade's basically, I don't care. Go take care of it.
Well, he gets a letter from Buford at some point during the day that says, there seems to be nobody in charge here. But the problem with that is, what the key of that letter is when it was written. If it's written soon after Reynolds was killed, it makes sense. If it's written mid-afternoon, it's an indictment of Howard. And that's the thing, is the timing. There's no timestamp on it. It's right?
Received at 3:20 p.m., but we don't know when it's sent.
And
and there's an interesting backstory, too. Aaron Jerome, Buford's signal officer, he's recalling when Buford is writing that note, there is no directing person, where he remembers Buford saying as he's writing that note, for God's sake, send up Hancock. Everything is at odds. And he sends that in a letter to Hancock in 1865. So that's interesting.
So everything is all falling apart. And so, of course, Meade, the pipe crew plan is out the window. Now we're going in. So at Gettysburg is where the battle's going to be. And, he's going to send Hancock. And Hancock has fresh eyes. But at this point, Howard, he's helping direct the troops. He's setting up the defensive line. Steinware's guys, ironically on Steinware Avenue. What a coincidence that is, right? And then as far as setting up the rest of the troops, there's that great story where he tells one of his flag bearers, put the flag. If you obviously know the area, if you look at East Cemetery Hill, there's the fields, there's the stone wall, and there's the fields, and there's the parking lot where the old visitor center, what do you call it? Cyclorama used to be. There's one more field of grass heading towards Jenny Wade's house. So he's telling a soldier, take the flag and put it on that wall. And he looks at Howard and goes, without obviously knowing who Howard was, I'll do it if you do it with me. And Howard has to show personal leadership. So he's like, all right. So he helps plant the flag on the wall. And he really helps set up that defense. And when Hancock finally does get there, there's the statue, he's sitting there with the whole I got this look and all that, right? This Heisman pose. But for the most part, he's coming in a situation where he hasn't experienced the mayhem. He's the 5th commander that day. And so he hasn't experienced everything that everyone else has, but he does settle the room down. He's a calming voice because he arrives calm. It's like your regular job. If your boss is freaking out, then you're going to freak out. If your boss is cool, then I've got this. It's the same psychological mentality. So he's going to help set up that natural defense while the Confederates are still helping, trying to figure out what they're going to do to finally take those hills as the day goes on.
But there is this story where you have the story that the statues are placed facing away from each other because apparently Howard and Hancock did not get along. But that's been proven to be a myth, likely.
You know who started that rumor, right? It was Abner Small.
Yep.
Because he did not like Howard.
Yep. And then there's different stories of what happens when Hancock arrives. Basically he arrives and he says he's in charge, and Howard, is said to have questioned it, and Hancock's like, well, you want to see the orders? And Howard just says, no, I don't need to. And basically the two of them get to work on East Cemetery Hill.
Yeah, he says, I trust you as a gentleman, but then there's that story where like I'll take this side, you take this side, which probably wasn't true, but it doesn't matter. Yeah. Everyone at that point is trying to set up the defenses for what's going to be happening next.
Yeah.
And I think this is an important place to make sort of a bigger picture point. Is so often we love, again, that battle of superlatives we talked about a bit ago, is, which corps broke first or 11th, or who should get credit for Cemetery Hill. And we want to place that decision, let's say, on one person. But really, it's one of those moments that in history, the big gray area between the black and the white is the truth, where we can give that credit to multiple people. Where people want to pin that solely on it's obviously Buford, he got things rolling, he gets the credit for Cemetery Hill, or it's Reynolds, he committed the army to battle at Gettysburg with his infantry, or it's Doubleday, he followed through with Reynolds' plan, or it's Howard who gets the official thanks of Congress for placing the first soldiers on Cemetery Hill, or it's Hancock because he did something with those soldiers on Cemetery Hill. But when you start to list that out, you can realize it was every single one of those individuals, without one of them at any point in the way making the decisions that they did, displaying the leadership that they did with what they knew and what they had in that moment, then we don't have the ultimate success story for the Union Army of holding on to Cemetery Hill by day's end. And it has to start with Buford conceptualizing this idea of, if nothing else, keeping Cemetery Hill sort of in the back of his mind as, if all else fails here, we'll fall back there. And Reynolds saying, we need to commit the army to battle here at Gettysburg. We'll fight through the streets, barricade the streets if necessary, keep the enemy from getting to the heights beyond the town as long as possible. So not necessarily let's go defend that, but let's stop them from getting there. And then eventually we can see the evolution of, by necessity really, of Howard arriving, realizing, all right, we need to put somebody here because it looks like it's becoming a numbers game. It's becoming a terrain game. We're going to be pushed back, and we can see that evolution play out.
Yeah, I mean, West Point at that point was, for the most part, was an engineering school. Yep. So it's not a surprise that every one of them saw Cemetery Hill as the key point of the battlefield. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, sometimes it's the master of the obvious. They all saw it. But in the first day's battle, you had 27,000 Confederates ultimately fighting 17,000 Union. And it was that positioning on Cemetery Hill which was the difference. It absolutely was. As the day goes on, there'll famously be an idea to take Cemetery Hill from the Confederate side, which is well debated. It goes on and on and on. But again, when you're looking at that point, you're getting late in the day. It's getting dark. How are the Confederates going to realistically, after fighting all day, famously take that hill, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and this is where it kind of goes back into the history of the Stonewall Jackson death, because Richard Ewell served directly under Jackson. He's used to getting very specific orders from Stonewall. You will do this, you will do that, you will not pass go, everything. Exactly. Versus Robert E. Lee was a macro manager. He would tell you, I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I want you to go do it.
Figure it out yourself, how to do it.
And so now Ewell had a great plan at 2nd Winchester. Ewell did. And then ultimately he's in this position again. And he's being told famously to take that hill if practicable, but don't bring on a general engagement. Which again, he had questioning Lee's orders, specifically when he was still north of the city, when he gets that order to come to the Gettysburg Cashtown area, which is 8 miles apart. And he says, does anybody in the general staff know how to give an intelligible order? And someone wrote it down. So right off the bat. So now he gets this order. He'd been fighting all day. And again, you're beaten up, and it's the mystery. We know now who was where and how everybody was coming. But at that time, I mean, the simple question is the 12th Corps. That's why they didn't take the hill practical. There's no question. But in Ewell's defense, he did ask Lee for reinforcements. You had guys like Thomas's brigade who had not fought. Anderson's division is coming on the field now. So you had the men. You actually did. But what happens is he decides he's not going to do it. And ultimately, he gets chided for that. But I think the reality is, without knowing what you're going yourself into, how are you going to possibly do that? You did everything wrong at that point, but you find yourself still in a position where you've won that first day's battle. Are you going to throw it all away?
Mm-hmm. And here's another point too, that a moment when we can see that just in terms of how Lee is a commander, as you mentioned, he's a macro level commander. And a good example of that and a rationale for that is Lee has been burned by having orders given to too many people written down, lost orders. General Orders 191 almost a year earlier is a great example of that. Lee has, I believe, 5 primary staff officers as an Army commander. He keeps a small staff around him plus his headquarters guard. John Reynolds, as a corps commander, as a wing commander in the Union Army, has just as many staff officers. Lee keeps this close-knit group of people, and he relies increasingly, post-1862, on verbal orders. And so even the whole notion of the line, take the hill if practicable but avoid a general engagement, that comes to us not from any sort of handwritten note. That comes to us from Lee's official report, which is filed in March 1864, better part of a year later. And so there are all these questions that we can bring into it. What literally did Ewell hear? What was he told? Can even be interpreted, through the lens of this is what Lee remembers taking place after the fact. And there's also this whole subtext that's happening that we don't have time to get into now, where Lee takes on and some of you have heard me talk about this before, he takes on this totally different tone in all of his written communication after he offers his resignation to Jefferson Davis and Davis declines. Lee puts everything on his own shoulders on this battlefield after July 3rd and says, it is all my fault. Lee writes letters home telling his family members, his wife, his cousins, our army was defeated and I believe it was me. And then when he tells Davis it was me, and Davis says, no, we have to keep you in command, then the whole tone of all of Lee's public correspondence becomes, Ewell didn't follow these orders. Longstreet dragged his feet. Stuart wasn't there. And we start to see Lee sort of defecting this blame. And that will play a role in that afternoon, July 1st.
And you'll see guys like Walter Taylor and Marshall carry the water for him a little bit too. But you put yourself in Richard Ewell's shoes. He's also getting reports from one of his brigade commanders, Extra Billy Smith, who was the governor-elect of Virginia, who's saying he thinks he sees Union troops on the York Road. Now, it turns out it was probably fence posts, realistically, but again, you're not going to tell the governor-elect of Virginia. And so now when you get this nebulous situation of, I don't know what I'm getting myself into, I know the 12th Corps is out there. I know they're arriving on the field. And the other thing that's a tell about it, too, was he was not court-martialed for that. Lee did not blame him. He did not come in his after-action battle report say that this specifically happened. So I think he truly said, well, if you can do it, do it. And I think he thought he'd mop up the next day. And despite the fact that Stuart wasn't there, he still had cavalry. The rumors that there was no horses here. There were, okay? And so at the end of the day, I think what happened was Lee found himself in a battle he did not think was going to happen that day. He had some success. He didn't want to push the envelope too far, and it was getting dark. Mm-hmm. I mean, darkness is the the end all be all with a lot of these battles for the most part.
Yep. And so at the end of the day, we have the Union establish themselves on East Cemetery Hill, and yes, they get the win goes to the Confederates for the day, but the Union have that ground at East Cemetery Hill, which is going to be, the focal point. Like, it is the important ground. The Battle of Gettysburg, as we know, will go on for another 2 days. July 2nd, you have Little Round Top and Culp's Hill. July 3rd, you have Pickett's Charge. At the end of it, it is a Union victory and a much-needed one. that they need at that time, and Lee will retreat.
Yeah, and some of the Confederate people will wring their hands later about the missed opportunity on that first day. You had 1.5 men to 1 advantage, but again, you're fighting in a place you don't know. You bumped into the enemy. You don't know the 24 hours before you thought there was militia in the town.
Yeah.
Now you're roped up with the entire Union Army, right? So you can see the situation going forward where you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater here. And again, Lee was riding that heater. Everything he was doing was touching goal at this point. So if he pulls out at this point and stops right there, he'll finish it up the next day, which leads to Longstreet's echelon attack and the attack on Culp's Hill by Ewell, and really more and more missed opportunities. In my opinion, they lost it on the second day. Mm-hmm. That's just my own personal opinion. There's a lot of opportunities with the second day, and if you believe Ambrose Wright, the Georgian, he got there, but he did not have support, and he blamed Lane until his dying day, right? But again, you can go and look at these and make those determinations. That's what's great about studying Gettysburg, is because you can make those decisions. You can look and you can see the positions that they did, and what would you do in that situation? I mean, if I'm Ewell, I'm not going up there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's probably a good place to drop off and take a few questions, because we have a few minutes left. Unless either of you have anything else to add about the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg.
No, and I think to Codie's point earlier, it's how instrumental the cupola here was and the seminary was, and a lot of people know the importance of this place. But when you look at the fact that how absolutely it really was that focal point in a lot of cases on that first day. It's great that it's still here, and it's great that you guys have the museum here now. People can visit this. So if you haven't been here, shame on you if you haven't been, because you really, especially if you're one of these Gettysburg people who comes here way more than you should, come here and visit and see this, because it's truly is a labor of love by you guys, and they do so many good things here. So, yeah, why not? Let's give Codie a round of applause right here, because he deserves it. He absolutely does. If anybody has any questions, be happy to do them. Otherwise, I knew you had a question, Lance.
I think when we look at the Battle of Gettysburg as a whole, a lot of attention is paid to the second and to the third day. Even if you go back to the Ken Burns documentary series, what's the line that's commonly said? Compared to the next 2 days, day one was a skirmish.
Right.
So, looking at this and the role that the first day has had in the story of this battle, the legacy of that, how has that impacted how we interpret this battlefield, and what role did the Union veterans have in shaping that memory?
Yeah. So, two pieces to that. One is just the statistical figure of, there's a great American Battlefield Trust page about 10 or 12, forget what the number is, greatest myths of Gettysburg, and this is one of them. And it breaks down the 15 bloodiest battles, not days, battles of the entire Civil War. Mm-hmm. And even if there had not been a July 2nd or a July 3rd, July 1st is, I believe, I think it's either the 10th or the 12th costliest battle of the entire war, even if it's not followed by two others. And then July 2nd is, I think July 1st is the 12th, July 2nd is the 10th, July 3rd is the 15th. Put those together, that's your bloodiest battle of the war, of course. So that's just in terms of what this first day costs. One of the reasons I think that we hear that, get that sense of quote unquote mere skirmish, is we don't have those really physically commanding places that live in our memory, like a Little Round Top, like a high water mark, like a Culp's Hill, which today is an overlooked piece of the battlefield, but is one of the first preserved pieces on the entire field, and for a long time is one of the most visited places on the field, because it's one of the rare places you could go to physically see battle damage on the sides of those trees. As far as Union veterans, there's this interesting phenomenon that is sort of in opposition to the lost cause of this promotion of a certain version of events by Confederate veterans, stripping away slavery's centrality to the causes of the war, stripping away any sort of blame for people like Robert E. Lee, etc. You have this notion you'll sometimes see referred to in scholarship in the latter part of the 20th century as the cause victorious, which is sort of only looking at things through a Unionist-centric lens. And one of the examples that we will see of this in terms of physical landscapes on battlefields is July 1st, 1863. To a lot of Union veterans, does anybody know what the Battle of July 1st, 1863 was called for a very long time?
meeting engagement?
Not me. Well, in terms of like, instead of the Battle of Gettysburg, what they call July 1st. Little trivia. The Battle of Oak Ridge is what July 1st is called. And July 2nd and 3rd is called the Battle of Gettysburg. And what this is it's a rhetorical device by Union veterans to say we won both days of the Battle of Gettysburg. We lost the Battle of Oak Ridge. And we see, for instance, 1867. Really where this takes off is a book by the historian James Watts de Peyster. And it's where one of Aaron Jerome's letters that tells the story of John Buford using the cupola. The book is is in a series called Decisive Conflicts of the Late Slaveholders Rebellion. Gives you a sense of de Peyster's view of the war. And Jerome's essay on July 1st, 1863, the essay in the book on July 1st is called Buford in the Battle of Oak Ridge. And then when it talks about July 2nd and 3rd, that it defines as the Battle of Gettysburg. And so that's one way that Union veterans utilize this technique to try to contextualize July 1st through a different lens. But then you also see in a lot of dedication addresses by 1st and 11th Corps veterans, not only the infighting between them of who held out the longest, who broke first, but you see this realization on their behalf that they feel as though they did participate in an overlooked piece of the battle, and they're trying to right that wrong of history. And then you have the physical landscape itself. On the July 1st battlefield, more than anywhere else on the battlefield, you have this weaving of private and public property, of preserved and continually used property. The Lutheran Seminary, Pennsylvania College, the town itself. And so the July 1st battlefield landscape, veterans don't have as great of an opportunity to preserve and to dedicate monuments here quite like they did on July 2nd and 3rd. And you have places like the Lutheran Seminary, which want to distance itself from the battle at all for a very long time, really until the 150th anniversary of the battle, to be frank, until our museum. There is this notion of don't mix together interpretation of this extraordinarily bloody event where people killed one another with this place of peace where ministers are being trained. And so you'll see in 1895 the War Department puts in its avenue, and a couple of War Department markers go up, and the 5th Maine Battery is able to put its marker a few feet off that road in 1890 or so. But by and large, this is not a landscape where veterans are even allowed to or able or frankly interested in, probably, because this is the last position they hold before they're pushed back. It's just a landscape that you would never know that there were the high casualty rates that there were that played out here. So there are multiple layers to that, but those are a couple of them.
That's a great question. Awesome answer. I mean, for me, like, ever since I visited Gettysburg when I was like 9 or 10 years old, I've always seen the first day as being a battle, like not just a skirmish. And in comparison, you look at something in the Western Theater like the Battle of Chickamauga, which is one of my probably my favorite battle to study. It gets that same reputation where the 18th gets brushed off. Where if you study the battle, if you look at what Minty and Wilder do there, which they use delaying tactics in the same way that Buford does, it is a 3-day battle. So that's why, like, I will always say, like, if Gettysburg can be a 3-day battle, so can Chickamauga. So thank you for your question, Mike. Any other questions?
I've understood actually from, I think it might have been one of your episodes about how George Meade was handing out the crackers. You know, there was a lot of privation and hunger among the troops. I guess the Union troops here because they had to use up supplies getting to Gettysburg. Whether and to what extent was that the case on the first day of the battle?
Well, at that point, Meade had decided there was going to be a battle here, so he basically had them clear the roads of supply wagons except for ammunition. The soldiers would come up here when they were given 3 days worth of rations when they came up here. So really, that was pretty much it for the most part. Their supply hub was over in Westminster, down the Taneytown Road, but those lines hadn't been set up yet. Baltimore Pike was a communication line to Washington. Westminster was going to be their supply line. But the troops came up with 3 days worth of rations, and then the priority, and that's why Sickles got in trouble with Meade, because he was slowing up, he was clogging up the roads with his wagons. He wanted to keep the wagons available for primarily for ammunition and for ambulances. A lot of the supplies came up later.
The other thing, too, with Westminster, Frederick, Emmitsburg, there's these big pockets there of where you have organizations that aren't directly supporting the armies going into battle with things like rations and such, but you have organizations like the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, which are constantly at the ready in places in bigger cities, especially in Washington, D.C., of course, but in 1862, they're really starting to gear up in Frederick. And so when it looks like there's going to be a battle somewhere between Frederick and Chambersburg or Frederick and Harrisburg in the last half of June, they're starting to get these things ready so that at a moment's notice, wherever that battle might take place, you can hurriedly get those supplies. And so that won't take place until right after the battle, but it's with pretty remarkable quickness that we see that these supplies, from all the way from bandages to foodstuffs to Bibles to workers, all get here in a pretty quick time period, because they had sort of been, had this training ground of the Battle of Antietam and the Maryland campaign. Now they've sort of set themselves up for this Western Maryland, South Central Pennsylvania region is suddenly thrust into the middle of affairs, and so they can get here pretty quickly by, at the latest, the second week of July in 1863.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, no question.
Well, we want to be very respectful of your time, Codie. So we know we're all almost at time here. But we want to thank you for joining us for our first ever live recording. We really appreciate the support and people being here for this. And also just to Codie and the Seminary Ridge Museum for joining us for this. Hope to have you back on again sometime.
Absolutely.
As a guest.
Please come back.
This was awesome. It's an honor for us to be here doing this at this very amazing place. And as Darren already said, you need to visit the Seminary Ridge Museum when you're in Gettysburg. It is one of the best museums I've ever been to. I've been, I don't know how many times now, and it's different every time I go. I always learn something new, and it is definitely an amazing telling of not just the first day of the battle, but as you said, the aftermath of that and what's happening with the citizens. It's not just the soldiers and all that. You guys do an awesome job here.
Well, thank you so much, Darren and Mary.
Yeah,
thank you all.
Absolutely can echo that. So we're enjoying the 24 hours on the ridge here. This is going to be a great day. So if you're in the area, I know this is going to drop afterwards, so it's pointless if I can say it. But if you can hear me yelling, try to come down and see it. But you guys do great work, and we're really blessed to have you and the people here who work at the seminary, because it's such a great, like Mary said, it's a great institution. It really tells the story of the soldier from that grassroots level we talked about. So kudos to you guys, and kudos to all of you coming out today. We really appreciate it. Thanks for everybody for listening to this episode, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Yep. See you guys later.
Peace out.
Bye.